Okay, so hi guys. I'm going to read Life of Pi right now. I'm gonna tweet out that I'm streaming first. Okay, streaming right now. Okay, so yeah, so I think we left off at the beginning of chapter 59. So we're gonna watch that. We're gonna read the beginning of chapter 59. Yeah. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 59. Alone or not, lost or not, I was thirsty and hungry. Also, my goal is to read to page 125, I think, today. Alone or not, lost or not, I was thirsty and hungry. I pulled on the rope. There was a slight tension. Sorry. There was a slight tension as soon as I loosened my grip on it. I slid out, and the distance between the lifeboat and the raft increased, so the lifeboat drifted faster than the raft, pulling it along. I noted the fact without thinking anything of it. My mind was more focused on the doings of Richard Parker, but by the looks of it, he was under the tarpaulin. I pulled the rope till I was right next to the bow. I reached up to the gunwale. As I was crouched, preparing myself for a quick raid on the locker, a series of waves got me thinking. I noticed that with the raft next to it, the lifeboat had changed directions. It was no longer perpendicular to the waves, but broadside to them, and was beginning to roll from side to side, and rolling that was so unsettling for the stomach. The reason for this change became clear to me. The raft, when let out, was acting like a sea anchor as a drag that pulled on the lifeboat and turned its bow to face the waves. You see, waves and steady winds are usually perpendicular to each other, so if a boat was pushed by wind but held back by a sea anchor, it will turn until it offers the least resistance to the wind, that is, until it is in line with it and at right angles to the waves, which makes for a front-to-back pitching that is much more comfortable than a side-to-side rolling. With the raft next to the boat, the dragging effect was gone, and there was nothing to steer the boat head into the wind. Therefore, it turned broadside and rolled. What may seem like a detail to you was something that would save my life, and which Richard Parker would come to regret. As if to confirm my fresh insight, I heard him growl. It was a disconsolate growl with something indefinably green and queasy in its tone. He may be a good swimmer, but he was not much of a sailor. I had a chance yet. Lest I got cocky about my abilities to manipulate him, I received at that moment a quiet but sinister warning about what I was up against. It seemed Richard Parker was such a magnetic pull of life, so charismatic in his vitality that other expressions of life found it intolerable. I was on the point of raising myself over the bow when I heard a gentle thrashing buzz. I saw something small land in the water next to me. It was a cockroach. It floated for a second or two before being swallowed by an underwater mouth. Another cockroach landed in the water. In the next minute, 10 or so cockroaches plopped into the water on either side of the bow. Each was claimed by a fish. The last of the foreign life forms was abandoning ship. I carefully brought my eyes over the gunwale. The first thing I saw lying in a fold of the tarpaulin above the bow bench was a large cockroach, perhaps the patriarch of the clan. I watched it strangely interested. When it decided it was time, it deployed its wings, rose in the air with a minute clattering, hovered above the lifeboat momentarily, as if making sure no one had been left behind, and then veered overboard to its death. Now we were 2 in 5 days. The populations of orangutans, zebras, hyenas, rats, flies, and cockroaches had been wiped out. Except for the bacteria and worms that might still be alive in the remains of the animals, there was no other life left on the lifeboat but Richard Parker and me. It was not comfort. It was not a comforting thought. I lifted myself and breathlessly opened the locker lid. I deliberately did not look under the tarpaulin for fear that looking would be like shouting would attract Richard Parker's attention. Only once the lid was leaning against the tarpaulin did I dare let my senses consider what was beyond it. A smell came to my nose, a musky smell of urine, quite sharp, what every cat cage in a zoo smells of. Tigers are highly territorial, and it is with their urine that they mark the boundaries of their territory. Here was good news wearing a foul dress. The odor was coming exclusively from below the tarpaulin. Richard Parker's territorial claims seemed to be limited to the floor of the boat. This held promise. If I could make the tarpaulin mine, we might get along. I held my breath, lowered my head, and cocked it to the side to see beyond the edge of the lid. There was rainwater, about 4 inches of it, sloshing about the floor of the lifeboat, Richard Parker's own freshwater pond. He was doing exactly what I would be doing at his place, cooling off in the shade. The day was getting beastly hot. He was flat on the floor of the boat, facing away from me. Let me see if I'm right. My calculations. Oh wait. Guess the number would be 140 something. My calculations were off. Okay, sorry. Beastly hot. He was flat on the floor of the boat, facing away from me, his hind legs sticking straight back and splayed out. Back paws facing up and stomach and inner thighs lying directly against the floor. The position looked silly, but was no doubt very pleasant. I returned to the business of survival. I opened a carton of emergency ration and ate my fill, about 1/3 of the package. It was remarkable how little it took to my stomach to feel full. Little took to make my stomach feel full. I was about to drink from the raincatcher pouch slung across my shoulder when my eyes fell upon the graduated drinking beakers. If I could go for a dip, I could at least have a sip. My own supplies of water would not last forever. I took hold one of the beakers, leaned over, lowered the lid just as much as I needed to, and tremendously dipped the beaker into Parker's pond. 4 feet from his back paws, his upturned pads with their wet fur looked like little desert islands surrounded by seaweed. I brought back a good 500 milliliters. It was a little discolored. Specks were floating in it. Did I worry about ingesting some horrid bacteria? I didn't even think about it. All I had on my mind was my thirst. I drained that beaker to the dregs with great satisfaction. Nature is preoccupied with balance. So it did not surprise me that nearly right away I felt the urge to urinate. I relieved myself in the beaker. I produced so exactly the amount that I had down that it was as if a minute hadn't passed and I was still considering Richard Parker's rainwater. I hesitated. I felt the urge to tilt the beaker into my mouth once more. I resisted the temptation, but it was hard. Mockery be damned. My urine looked delicious. I was not suffering yet from dehydration, so the liquid was pale in color. It glowed in the sunlight, looking like a glass of apple juice, and it was guaranteed fresh, which certainly couldn't be said of the canned water that was my staple. But I heeded my better judgment. I splashed my urine on the tarpaulin and over the locker lid to stake my claim. I stole another 2 beakers of water from Richard Parker without urinating this time. I felt as freshly watered as a potted plant. Now it was time to prove my situation. I turned the contents of the locker and the many promises they held. I turned to the contents of the locker and the many promises they held. I brought out a second rope and tethered the raft to the lifeboat with it. I discovered what a solar still is. I discovered what a solar still is. A solar still is a device to produce fresh water from salt water. It consists of an inflatable transparent cone set up upon a round life buoy-like buoyancy chamber that has a surface of black rubberized canvas. Chamber that has a surface of black rubberized canvas stretched across its center. The still operates on the principle of distillation. Seawater lying beneath the sealed cone on the back canvas is heated by the sun and evaporates, gathering on the inside surface of the cone. The salt-free water trickles down and collects in a guilty on the perimeter of the cone, from which it drains into a pouch. The lifeboat came equipped with 12 solar stills. I read the instructions carefully as the survival manual told me to. I inflated all 12 cones with air, and I filled each buoyancy chamber with the requisite 10 liters of seawater. I strung the stills together, tying one end of the flotilla to the lifeboat and the other to the raft, which meant that not only would I lose any stills should one of my knots become loose, but also that I had in effect a second emergency rope to keep me tethered to the lifeboat. The stills looked pretty and very technological as they floated on the water, but they also looked flimsy, and I was doubtful of their capacity to produce fresh water. I directed my attention of improving the raft. I examined every knot that held it together, making sure each was tight and secure. After some thought, I decided to transform the fifth footrest oar into a mast of sorts. I undid the oar. With the sawtooth edge of the hunting knife, I painstakingly cut a notch into it about halfway down, and with the knife's point I drilled 3 holes through its flat part. Work was slow but satisfying. It kept my mind busy. When I finished, I lashed the oar into a vertical position to the inside of one of the corners of the raft flat part, the masthead rising in the air. Handle disappearing underwater, I ran the rope tightly into the notch to prevent the oar from slipping down. Next, to ensure that the mast would stand straight and to give myself lines from which to hang a canopy and supplies, I threaded ropes through the holes that drilled the masthead and tied them to the tips of the horizontal oars. I strapped my life jacket that had been attached to the footrest oar to the base of the mast. It would play a double role. It would provide extra flotation to compensate for the vertical weight of the mast, and it would make for a slightly raised seat for me. I threw a blanket over the lines and slid down. The angle of the lines was too steep. I folded the lengthwise edge of the blanket over once, cut holes midway down, about a foot apart, and linked the holes with a piece of string, which I made by unweaving a length of rope. I threw the blanket over the lines again with the new girdle string going around the mast head. Now I had a canopy. It took a good part of the day to fix up the raft. There were so many details to look after. The constant motion of the sea, though gentle, did not make my work any easier, and I had to keep an eye on Richard Parker. The result was no galleon. The mast, so-called, ended hardly a few inches above my head. As for the deck, it was just big enough to sit on cross-legged, or so lie on the tight, nearly to term fetal position, but I wasn't complaining. It was seaworthy and it would save me from Richard Parker. By the time I had finished my work, the afternoon was nearing its end. I gathered a can of water, a can opener, 4 biscuits, a survival ration, and 4 blankets. I closed the locker very softly this time, sat down on the raft, and let out the rope. The lifeboat drifted away. The main rope tensed, while the security rope, which I had deliberately measured out longer, hung limply. I had 2 blankets beneath me, carefully folding them so that they didn't touch the water. I wrapped the other 2 around my shoulders and rested my back against the mast. I enjoyed the slight elevation I gained from sitting on the extra life jacket. I was hardly higher up from the water than one would be from a floor sitting on a thick cushion. Still, I hoped not to get wet so much. I enjoyed my meal as I watched the sun's descent in a cloudless sky. It was a relaxing moment. The vault of the world was magnificently tinted. The stars were eager to participate. Hardly had the blanket of color been pulled a little than they started to shine through the deep blue. The wind blew with a faint warm breeze, and the sea moved kindly, the water peaking and troughing like people dancing in a circle who come together and raise their hands and move apart and come together again over and over. Richard Parker sat up. Only his head and a little of his shoulders showed above the gunwale. He looked out. I shouted, "Hello, Richard Parker," and I waved. He looked at me. He snorted and sneezed. Neither word quite captures it. Proston again. What a stunning creature, such a noble mien. How apt that in a full it is a Royal Bengal tiger. I counted myself lucky in a way. What if I had ended up with a creature that looked silly or ugly? A tapir or an ostrich of a flock of turkeys. That would have been a more trying companionship in some ways. I heard a splash. I looked down at the water. I gasped. I thought I was alone. The stillness in the air, the glory of the light, the feeling of comparative safety all had me think so. There is calmly an element of silence and solitude to peace, isn't there? It's hard to imagine being at peace in a busy subway station, isn't it? So what was all this commotion? With a glance I discovered that the sea is a city just below me. All around, unsuspected by me, were highways, boulevards, streets, and roundabouts bustling with submarine traffic and water that was dense, glassy, and flecked by millions of lit-up specks of plankton fish like trucks and buses and cars and bicycles, and pedestrians were madly racing about. No doubt honking and hollering at each other. The predominant color was green at multiple depths. As far as I could see, there were evanescent trails of phosphorescent green bubbles and the wake of speeding fish. As soon as one trail faded, another appeared. These trails came from all directions and disappeared in all directions. They were like those time exposure photographs you see of cities at night with long streaks made by the tail lights of cars, except here the cars were driving above and under each other as if they were interchanges that were stacked 10 stories high. And here the cars were the craziest colors. Okay. Interchanges that were stacked 10 stories high, and here the cars were the craziest colors. The Dorados here must have been over 50 patrolling beneath. The raft showed off their bright gold, blue, and green as they whisked by. Other fish that I could not identify were yellow, brown, silver, blue, red, pink, green, white, and all kinds of combinations solid streaked and speckled. Only the shark stubbornly refused to be colorful. But whatever the size or color of a vehicle, one thing was constant: the furious driving. There were many collisions. All involved fatalities, I'm afraid, and a number of cars spun wildly out of control and collided against barriers, bursting above the surface of the water and splashing down in showers of luminescence. I gazed upon the urban Hurley, burly like someone observing a city from a hot air balloon. It was a spectacle wondrous and awe-inspiring. This was surely what Tokyo must look like at rush hour. I looked on until the lights went out in the city. From the Timsum, all I had seen were dolphins. I had assumed that the Pacific, but for passing schools of fish, was a sparsely inhabited waste of water. I had learned since that cargo ships travel too quickly for fish. You are as likely to see life from a ship as you are to see wildlife in a forest from a car on a highway. Dolphins, very fast swimmers, play about boats and ships like dogs chase cars. They race along until they can no longer keep up. If you want to see wildlife, it is on foot, and quietly that you must explore a forest. It is the same with the sea. You must stroll through the Pacific at a walking pace, so to speak, to see a wealth and abundance that it holds. I settled on my side for the first time in 5 days. I felt measure of calm. A little bit of hope, hard earned, well-deserved, reasonable glowed in me. I fell asleep. Chapter 60. I awoke once during the night. I pushed the canopy aside and looked out. The moon was a sharply defined crescent, and the sky was perfectly clear. The stars shone with such fierce, contained brilliance that it seemed absurd to call the night dark. The sea lay quietly bathed in a shy, light-footed light, a dance play of black and silver that extended without limits all about me. The volume of things was confounding. The volume of air above me, the volume of water around and beneath me. I was half moved, half terrified. I felt like the sage Markandeya, who fell out of Vishnu's mouth while Vishnu was sleeping, and beheld the entire universe, everything that there is, before the sage could die of fright. Vishnu awoke and took it back into his mouth. For the first time I noticed, as I would notice repeatedly during my ordeal, between one throe of agony and for the next, that my suffering was taking place in a grand setting. I saw my suffering for what it was, finite and insignificant, and I was still. My suffering did not fit anywhere, I realized, and I could I could accept this. It was all right. It was daylight that brought my protest. No, my suffering does not matter. I want to live. I can't help but mix my life with that of the universe. Life is a peephole, a single tiny entry onto a vastness. How can I not dwell on this brief, cramped view I have of things? The peephole is all I've got. I mumbled words of Muslim prayer and went back to sleep. Chapter 61. The next morning, I was not too wet and I was feeling strong. I thought this was remarkable considering the strain I was under and how little I had eaten in the last several days. It was a fine day. I decided to try my hand at fishing for the first time in my life. After a breakfast of 3 biscuits and 1 can of water, I read what the survival manual had to say on the subject. The first problem arose: bait. I thought about it. There were the dead animals, but stealing food under a tiger's nose was a proposition I was not up to. He would not realize that it was an investment that would bring him an excellent return. I decided to use my leather shoe. I had only one left. The other I lost when the ship sank. I crept to the lifeboat and I gathered from the locker one of the fishing kits. A knife and a bucket for my catch. Richard was lying on his side. His tail jumped to life when I was at the bow, but his head did not lift. I left the raft out. I attached a hook to a wire leader, which I tied to a line. I added some lead weights. I picked 3 that had an intriguing torpedo shape. I removed my shoe and cut it into pieces. It was hard work. The leather was tough. I carefully worked the hook into a flat piece of hide, not through it but into it, so that the point of the hook was hidden. I let down the line. I let the line down deep. There had been so many fish the previous evening that I expected easy success. I had none. The whole shoe disappeared bit by bit, a slight tug on the line by a slight tug on the line. Happy freeloading fish was fish by happy freeloading fish. Bear hook my bear hook. Until I was left with oh jeez. Until I was led with the rubber sole and the shoelace. When the shoelace proved an unconvincing earthworm, out of sheer exasperation, I tied the sole, all of it. It was not a good idea. I felt a slight promising tug, and then the line was unexpectedly light. All I pulled in was line. I lost the whole tackle. This loss did not strike me as a terrible blow. There were other hooks, leader wires, and weights in the kit, besides a whole other kit. And I wasn't even fishing for myself. I had plenty of food in store. Still a part of my mind, the one that says we don't want to hear rebuked me. Stupidity has a price. You should show more care and wisdom next time. Later that morning, a second turtle appeared. It came right up to the raft. I couldn't have reached up and bit my bottom if it had wanted to. When it turned, I reached for its hind flipper, but as soon as I touched it, I recoiled in horror. The turtle swam away. Oh, jeez. The same part of my mind that had rebuked me over my fishing fiasco scolded me again. What exactly do you intend to feed that tiger of yours? How much longer do you think he'll last on 3 dead animals? Do I need to remind you that tigers are not carrion eaters? Granted, when he's on his last legs, he probably won't lift his nose as much, but you don't think that before he submits to eating puffy, putrefied zebra, he'll try the fresh, juicy Indian boy just a short dip away? And how are we doing with the water situation? You know how tigers get impatient with thirst. Have you smelled his breath recently? It's pretty awful. That's a bad sign. Perhaps you're hoping that he'll lap up the Pacific and quenching his thirst allow you to walk to America? Quite amazing, this limited capacity to excrete salt that Sundarbans tigers have developed come from living in a tidal mangrove forest, I suppose, but it is a limited capacity. Won't they say that drinking too much saline water makes a man-eater of a tiger? Oh look, speak of the devil. There he is, he's yawning. My, what an enormous pink cave. Look at those long yellow I don't know how to pronounce this, sorry. Stalactites and stalagmites. Maybe today you'll get a chance to visit. Richard Parker's tongue, the size and color of a rubber hot water bottle, retreated and his mouth closed. He swallowed. I spent the rest of the day worrying myself sick. I stayed away from the lifeboat despite my own dire predictions. Richard Parker passed the time calmly enough. He still had water from the rainfall, and he didn't. Yeah, sorry. He didn't seem too concerned with hunger, but he did make various tiger noises, growls, and moans, and the like. That did nothing to put me at ease. The riddle seemed irresolvable. To fish, I need bait, but I would have bait only once I had fish. What was I supposed to do? Cut one of my toes, cut off one of my ears? A solution appeared in the late afternoon in a most unexpected way. I had pulled myself up to the lifeboat. More than that, I climbed aboard and was rummaging through the locker, feverishly looking for an idea that would save my life. I tied the raft so that it was about 6 feet from the boat. I fancied that with a jump and a pull at a loose knot, I could save myself from Richard Parker. Desperation had pushed me to take such a risk. Finding nothing, no bait, and no new idea, I sat upon only to discover that I was dead center in the focus of his stare. He was at the other end of the lifeboat. Oh, jeez. Sorry for that sound. Oh my gosh. Because I'm like kind of congested because allergies. Hi, Mark. Not exactly sure who you are, but hi. Where's my book? Where was I? Finding nothing, no bait, and no new idea, I sat up only to discover that I was dead center in the focus of his stare. He was at the one end of the boat where the zebra used to be. I turned my way and sitting up, looking as if he'd been patiently waiting for me to notice him. How was it that I hadn't heard him stir? What delusion was I under that I thought I could outwit him? Suddenly I was hit hard across the face. I cried out and closed my eyes. With feline speed, he had leapt across the lifeboat and struck me. I was to have my face clawed off. This was the gruesome way I was to die. The pain was so severe I felt nothing. Blessed be shock. Blessed be the power of us that protects us from too much pain and sorrow. At the heart of life in a ruse box, I whimpered, "Go ahead, Richard Parker, finish me up, but please, what you must do quickly. A blown fuse should not be over-tested." He was taking his time. He was at my feet, making noises. No doubt he had discovered the locker and its riches. I fearfully opened an eye. It was a fish. There was a fish in the locker. It was flopping about like a fish out of water. It was about 15 inches long and had wings. A flying fish, slim and dark gray. Blue with dry. Featherless wings and round, unblinking yellowish eyes. It was this flying fish that struck me across the face, not Richard Parker. He was still 15 feet away. No doubt wondering what I was going on about, but he had seen the fish. I could read a keen curiosity on his face. He seemed about ready to investigate. I bent down, picked up the fish, and threw it towards him. This was the way to tame him. There was a rat. Where a rat had gone, a flying fish would follow. Unfortunately, the flying fish flew in mid-air just ahead of Richard Parker's open mouth. The fish swerved and dropped into the water and had him with lightning speed. Richard Parker turned his head and slapped his mouth. jowls flapping, but the fish was too quick for him. He looked astonished and displeased. He turned to me again. "Where is my treat?" His face seemed to inquire. Fear and sadness groped at me. I turned with the half-hearted, half-abandoned hope that I could jump onto the raft before he could jump onto me. At that precise instant there was a vibration in the air, and we were struck by a school of flying fish. They came like a swarm of locusts. It was not only their numbers. There was also something insect-like about the clicking, whirring sound of the wings. They burst out of the water, dozens of them at a time, some of them flicking over 100 yards through the air. Many dived into the water just before the boat. A number sailed clear over it. Some crashed into its side. Something like firecrackers going off, several lucky ones returned to the water after a bounce on the tarpaulin. Others, less fortunate, fell directly into the boat, where they started a racket of flapping and flailing and splashing, and still others flew right into us, standing unprotected as I was. I felt I was living... oh, jeez. I felt I was living the martyrdom. Okay, I don't know what that says. Hold on. The martyrdom, martyrdom. How do I pronounce that word? Martyrdom, okay. Okay, let me try Google Translate. Okay. Martyrdom. The martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. Every fish that hit me was like an arrow entering my flesh. I clutched at a blanket to protect myself while also trying to catch some fish. I received cuts and bruises all over my body. The reason for this onslaught became evident immediately. Dorados were leaping out of the water in hot pursuit of them. The much larger Dorados couldn't match their flying, but they were faster swimmers and their short lunges were very powerful. They could overtake flying fish if they were just behind them and lunging. From the water at the same time and in the same direction there were sharks too. They also leapt out of the water, not so cleanly, but with devastating consequences from the Dorados. This aquatic mayhem didn't last long, but while it did, the sea bubbled and boiled. Fish jumped and jaws worked hard. Richard Parker was tougher than I was in the face of these fish, and far more efficient. He raised himself and went about blocking, swiping, and biting all the fish he could. Many were eaten alive and whole struggling, wings beating in his mouth. It was a dazzling display of might and speed. Actually, it was not so much the speed that was impressive as the pure animal confidence. The total absorption in that moment, such a mix of ease and concentration, such a being in the present, would be the envy of the highest yogis. When it was over, the result, besides a very sore body for me, was 6 flying fish in the locker and a much greater number in the lifeboat. I hurriedly wrapped a fish in a blanket, gathered a hatchet, and made for the raft. I proceeded with such great deliberation. The loss of my tackle that morning had a sobering effect on me. I couldn't allow myself another mistake. I unwrapped the fish carefully, keeping a hand pressed down on it, fully aware that it would try to jump away to save itself, The closer the fish was to appearing, the more afraid and disgusted I became. Its head came into sight the way I was holding it. It looked like a scoop of loathsome fish ice cream sticking out like a wool blanket cone. Out of a wool blanket cone. The thing was grasping for water, its mouth and gills opening and closing slowly. Oh, jeez. I could feel it pushing with its wings against my hand. I turned the bucket over and brought its head against the bottom. I took hold of the hatchet. I raised it in the air. Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Such sentimentalism may seem ridiculous considering what I had witnessed in the last days, but those were the deeds of others, of predatory animals. I suppose I was partly responsible for the rat's death, but I'd only thrown it. It was Richard Parker who had killed it. A lifetime of peaceful vegetarianism stood between me and the willful beheading of a fish. I covered the fish's head with the blanket, turned the hatchet around. Again my hand wavered in the air. The idea of beating a soft living head with a hammer was simply too much. I put the hatchet down. I would break its neck, sight unseen. I decided I wrapped the fish tightly in the blanket. With both hands I started bending it. The more I pressed, the more the fish struggled. I imagined what it would feel like if I were trapped in a blanket and someone were trying to break my neck. I was appalled. Jeez. I'm making strange noises. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna blow my nose for a quick sec, so be right back. Okay, hey guys, I'm back. Okay, let's keep trucking. I covered the fish's head with the blanket and turned the hatchet around. Again my hand wavered in the air. The idea of beating a soft, living head with a hammer was simply too much. I put the hatchet down. I would break its neck. Sight unseen, I decided I wrapped the fish tightly in the blanket with both hands. I started bending it. The more I pressed, the more the fish struggled. I imagined what it would feel like if I were wrapped in a blanket and someone were trying to break my neck. I was appalled. I gave up a number of times, yet I know it had to be done, and the longer I waited, the longer the fish's suffering would go on. Tears flowing down my cheeks, I egged myself on, and I heard a crackling sound, and I no longer felt any life fighting in my hands. I pulled back the folds of the blanket. The flying fish was dead. It was split open and bloody on one side of its head, the level of the gills. At the level of the gills. I wept heartily over the floor, over this poor little deceased soul. It was the first sentient being I had ever killed. I was now a killer. I was now as guilty as Cain. I was 16 years old, a harmless boy, bookish and religious, and now I had blood on my hands. It was a terrible burden to carry. All sentient life is sacred. I never forget to include this fish in my prayers. After that, it was easier now that it was dead. The flying fish looked like fish. I had seen in the markets of Pondicherry. It was something else, something outside this essential scheme of creation. I chopped it into pieces with the hatchet and put it in the bucket. In the dying hours of the day, I tried fishing again. At first, I had no better luck than I'd had in the morning, but success seemed less elusive. The fish nibbled at the hook with fervor. The interest was evident. I realized that these were small fish, too small for the hook, so I cast my line further and let it sink deeper, beyond the reach of the small fish that concentrated around the raft and lifeboat. It was when I used the flying fish's head to bait, and with only one stinker, casting my line out and pulling it in quickly, making the head skim over the surface of the water, that I finally had my first strike. A dorado surged forth and lunged for the fish's head. I let out a little slack to make sure it had probably swallowed the bait. Before giving the line a good yank, the dorado exploded out of the water, tugging on the line so hard I thought it was going to pull me off the raft. I braced myself. The line became very taut. It was good line. It would not break. I started bringing the dorado in. I struggled with it with all its might, jumping and diving and splashing. The line cut into my hands. I wrapped my hands in the blanket. My heart was pounding. The fish was as strong as an ox. I was not sure I was able to pull it in. I noticed all the other fish had vanished from around the raft and boat. No doubt they had sensed the Dorado's distress. I hurried. It struggling would attract sharks. But it fought like a devil. My arms were aching. Every time I got close to the raft, it beat about with such a frenzy that I was crowded into getting some line. At last I managed to haul it aboard. It was over 3 feet long. The bucket was useless. It would fit the Dorado. Oh, the BRB is still there. Okay. Dorado is a magnificent-looking fish, large, fleshy, and sleek, with a bulging forehead that speaks of a forceful personality, a very long dorsal fin, as proud as a coxcomb, and a coat of scales that is smooth and bright. I felt I was dealing with a serious blow by engaging such a handsome adversary. With this fish, I was retaliating against the sea, against the wind, against the sinking of ships, against all circumstances that were working against me. Thank you, Lord Vishnu. Thank you, I shouted. Once you saved the world by taking the form of a fish, now you have saved me from taking the form of a fish. Thank you, thank you. Killing it was no problem. I would have spared myself the trouble after all. Well, that's a typo. It was for Richard Parker and he... Wait, is the typo in the book? I have the book. I don't know what page it is. Let me see. I'm looking in the book. I don't know what page I'm on in the book because the book pages are different. Oh, right here. Oh yeah, it is a typo. Not in the book, but in this PDF. The trouble, after all, it was for Richard Parker, and he would have dispatched it with expert ease. But for the book that was embedded in his mouth, I exulted at having a Dorado at the end of my line. I would have less. I would be less keen if I were a tiger. I went about the job in a direct way. I took the hatchet in both hands and vigorously beat the fish out on the head with the hammerhead. I still didn't have the stomach. Oh, maybe their E key was broken or something. The stomach to use the sharp edge. The Dorado did a most extraordinary thing as it died. It began to flash all kinds of colors in rapid succession. Blue, green, red, gold, and violet flickered and shimmered neon-like on its surface as it struggled. I felt it was beating a rainbow to death. I was beating a rainbow to death. I found out later that the Dorado is famed for its death knell iridescence. At last it lay still and dull-colored, and I could remove the hook. I even managed to retrieve a part of my bait. You may be astonished that in such a short period of time I would go from weeping over the muffled killing of a flying fish to gleefully bludgeoning to death a Dorado. I could explain it by arguing that profiting from a pitiful flying fish's navigational mistake made me shy and sorrowful, while the excitement of actively capturing a great Dorado made me sanguinary and self-assured, but in point of fact, the explanation lies elsewhere. It is simple and brutal. A person can get used to anything, even to killing. It was with a hunter's pride that I pulled the raft up to the lifeboat. I brought it along the side, keeping very low. I swung my arm and dropped the Dorado into the boat. It landed with a heavy thud and provoked a gruff expression of surprise from Richard Parker. After a sniff or two, I heard the wet mashing sound of a mouth at work. I pushed myself off, not forgetting to blow the whistle hard several times. I reminded Richard Parker of who had so graciously provided him with fresh food. I stopped to pick up some biscuits and a can of water. The 5 remaining flying fish in the locker were dead. I pulled their wings off, throwing them away, and wrapped the fish in the now consecrated fish blanket. By the time I had rinsed myself of blood, I cleaned up my fishing gear and putting things away that had my supper. By the time I rinsed myself of blood, cleaned my fishing gear, put things away, and had my supper, night had come on. A thin layer of clouds masked the stars and the moon, and it was very dark. I was tired, but still excited by the events of the last hours. The feeling of busyness was profoundly satisfying. I hadn't thought at all about the plight of or myself. Fishing was surely a better way of passing the time than yarn spinning or playing I Spy. I determined to start again the next day as soon as there was light. I fell asleep, my mind lit up by chameleon-like flickering of the dying Dorado. Chapter 62. I slept in fits that night. Shortly before sunrise, I gave up trying to fall asleep again and lifted myself on an elbow. I spied with my little eye a tiger. Richard Parker was restless. He was moaning and growling and pacing about the lifeboat. It was impressive. I assessed the situation. He couldn't be hungry, or at least not dangerously hungry. Was he thirsty? His tongue hung from his mouth, but only on occasion, and he was not panting, and his stomach and paws were still wet, but they were not dripping wet. There probably wasn't much water left in the boat. Soon he would be thirsty. I looked up at the sky. The cloud cover had vanished, but for a few wet wisps on the horizon, the sky was clear. It would be another hot, rainless day. The sea moved in a lethargic way, as if already exhausted by the oncoming heat. I sat against the mast and thought over our problem. The biscuits and the fishing gear assured us of the solid part of our diet. It was the liquid part that was the rub. It all came down to what was so abundant around us but marred by salt. I could perhaps mix some seawater with his fresh water, but I had to procure more fresh water to start with. The cans would not last long between the two of us. In fact, I was loath to share even one with Richard Parker, and it would be foolish to rely on rainwater. The solar stills were the only other possible source of drinkable water. I looked at them doubtfully. They had been out 2 days now. I noticed that one of them had lost a little air. Without any real expectations, I reached underwater for the distillate pouch that was clipped to the round buoyancy chamber. My fingers took hold of a bag that was unexpectedly fat. A shiver of thrill went through me. I controlled myself. As likely as not, salt water had leaked in. I unhooked the pouch and followed the instructions. Lowered it and tilted the still so that any more water from beneath the cone might flow into it. I closed 2 more labs that led to the pouch. I detached and pulled it out of the water. It was rectangular in shape and made of thick, soft yellow plastic with calibration marks on one side. I tasted the water. I tasted it again. It was salt-free. My sweet sea cow, I exclaimed to the solar still. You've produced, and how? What a delicious milk. Mind you, a little rubbery, but I'm not complaining. Why, look at me drink. I finished the bag. It had a capacity of 1 liter and was already full. At that moment, a high-producing shut-eye satisfaction. I reattached the pouch. I checked the other stills. Each one had an udder similarly heavy. I collected the fresh milk, over 8 liters of it. The fish bucket in the fish bucket instantly. These technological contraceptions became as precious to me as cattle are to a farmer. Indeed, as they floated placidly into an ark, they almost looked like cows grazing in a field. I ministered to their needs, making sure that there was enough sea water inside each, and that the cones and chambers were inflated just the right pressure. After adding a little seawater to the bucket's contents, I placed it on the side bench just beyond the tarpaulin. With the end of the morning coolness, Richard Parker seemed safely settled below. I tied the bucket in place using rope and the tarpaulin hooks on the side of the boat. I carefully peeked over the gunwale. He was lying on his side. His dead was a foul sight. The dead animals were heaped together, a grotesque pile of decayed animal parts. I recognized a leg or two, various patches of hide, parts of a head, and a great number of bones. Flying fish wings were scattered about. I cut up the falling fish and tossed a piece onto the side bench. After I had gathered what I needed for the day from the locker and was ready to go, I tossed another piece of tarpaulin in front of Richard Parker. It had the intended effect. As I drifted away, I saw him come out onto the ropes to fetch the morsel of fish. His head turned and he noticed the other morsel and the new object next to it. He lifted himself. He hung his huge head over the bucket. I was afraid he would tip it over. He did. His face disappeared into it. Barely fitting, and he started to lap up the water. In very little time, the bucket started shaking and rattling emptily with each strike of his tongue. When he looked up, I stared him aggressively in the eyes and blew on the whistle a few times. He disappeared under the tarpaulin. It occurred to me that with every passing day, the lifeboat was resembling a zoo enclosure more and more. Richard Parker had his sheltered area where sleeping and resting, his food stash and lookout, his lookout, and now his water hole. The temperature climbed. The heat became stifling. I spent the rest of the day in the shade of the canopy fishing. It seems I had beginner's luck with that first Dorado. I caught nothing the whole day, not even in the late afternoon, when marine life appeared in abundance. A turtle turned up, a different kind this time, a green sea turtle, bulkier and smoother shelled, but curious in the same fixed way as the hawksbill. I did nothing about it, but I started thinking that I should. The only good thing about the day being so hot was the sight the solar stills presented. Every cone was covered on the inside with drops of rivulets of condensation. The day ended. I calculated that morning that would make the day ended. I calculated the next morning would make it a week since the Simsum had sunk. Chapter 63. The Robertson family survived 38 days at sea. Captain Bligh of the celebrated Mutinous Bounty and his fellow castaways survived 47 days. Stephen Callahan survived 76. Owen Chase, who accounted of the sinking of the whaling ship Essex by a whale-inspired Herman Melville, survived 83 days at sea with 2 mates. Interrupted by a 1 week stay on an inhospitable island. The Bailey family lasted 118 days. I heard of the Korean merchant sailor named Poon, I believe, who survived the Pacific for 173 days in the 1950s. I survived 227 days. That's how long my trial lasted, over 7 months. I kept myself busy. That was one key to my survival. On a lifeboat, even on a raft, there was something that needs doing, an average day for me. Such emotion can be applied to a castaway when like this: sunrise to mid-morning, wake up, prayers, breakfast for Richard Parker, general inspection of raft and lifeboat with particular attention paid to all knots and ropes, tending on solar stills, wiping, inflating, topping off with water, breakfast, and inspection of food stores. Fishing and preparing of fish, if any caught, gutting, cleaning, hanging of strips, flesh on lines to cure in the sun. Mid-morning to late afternoon, prayers, light lunch, rest and restful activities, writing diary, examining of scabs and sores, upkeeping of equipment, puttering about locker, observation and study of Richard Parker, picking of a turtle, bones, etc. Late afternoons to early evenings, prayers, fishing and preparing a fish, tending to curing strips of flesh, turning over, cutting away putrid parts, dinner preparations, dinner for self and Richard Parker, sunset. General inspection of raft and lifeboat, knots and ropes again, collecting and safekeeping of distillate from solar stills, storing of all foods and equipment, arrangement for night making a bed, safe storage on raft, a flare in case of ship, and rain catcher in case of rain. Prayers. Night. Fitful sleeping prayers. Mornings were usually better than late afternoon when the emptiness of time tended to make itself felt. Any number of events affected this routine. Rainfall at any time of the day or night stopped all other business for as long as it fell. I held up the rain catchers and was feverishly occupied storing their catch. A turtle's visit was another major disruption, and Richard Parker, of course, was a regular disturbance. Accommodating him was a priority I could not neglect for an instant. He did not have much of a routine beyond eating, drinking, and sleeping, but there were many times when he stirred from his lethargy and rambled about his territory, making noises and being cranky. Thankfully, every time the sun and the sea quickly tired him, and he returned to beneath the tarpaulin, to lying on his side again, or flat on his stomach, his head on top of his crossed front legs. But there was more to my dealings with him than strict necessity. I also spent hours observing him because it was a distraction. A tiger is a fascinating animal at any time, and all the more so when it is your sole companion. At first, looking out for a ship was something I did all the time. Compulsively, after a few weeks, 5 or 6, I stopped doing it near entirely. And I survived because I made a point of forgetting. My story started on a calendar day, July 2nd, 1977, and ended on a calendar day, February 14th, 1978. But in between, there was no calendar. I did not count the days or weeks or the months. Time is an illusion that makes us pant. I survived because I forgot even the very notion of time. What I remember are events and encounters and routines, markers, and that emerged here and there from the ocean of time and imprinted themselves on my memory. The smell of spent hand flare shells and prayers at dawn, and the killing of turtles and the biology of algae, for example, and many more, but I don't know if I can put them in order for you. My memories come in a jumble. Chapter 64. My clothes disintegrated, victims of the sun and the salt. First they became gauze thin. Then they tore until only the seams were left. Lastly, the seams broke. For months I lived stark naked except for the whistle that dangled from my neck by a string. Salt water boils, red, angry, disfiguring, were a leprosy of the high seas, transmitted by the water that soaked me. Where they burst, my skin was exceptionally sensitive. Accidentally rubbing an open sore was so painful. I would gasp and cry out. Naturally, these boils developed on the parts of my body that got the most wet and the most wear on the raft. That is, my backside. There were days when I could find a position where I could hardly find a position in which I could rest. The time in sunshine healed a sore, but the process was slow, and new boils appeared if I didn't stay dry. Chapter 65. I spent hours trying to decipher the lines in the survival manual of navigation. Plain and simple explanations on living off the sea were given in abundance, but a basic knowledge of seafaring was assumed by the author of the manual. The castaway was to his mind an experienced sailor who compass, chart, and sextant in hand. I knew how he found his way into trouble, if not how he would get out of it. The result was advice such as, remember the time is distance. Don't forget to wind your watch, or latitude can be measured with the fingers if need be. I had a watch, but it was now at the bottom of the Pacific. I lost it when the Simpsons sank. As for latitude and longitude, my marine knowledge was strictly limited to what lived in the sea and did not extend to what cruised on top. Winds and currents were a mystery to me. The stars meant nothing to me. I couldn't name a single constellation. My family lived by one star alone, the sun. We were early to bed and early to rise. I had in my life looked at a number of beautiful starry nights, where with just two colors and the simplest of styles, nature draws the grandest of pictures. I felt the feelings of wonder and smallness that we all feel, and I got a clear sense of direction from the spectacle, most definitely. But I mean, in a spiritual sense, not in a geographic one. I had not the faintest idea how the night sky might have served as a road map. How could the stars sparkle as they might help me find my way if they kept moving? I gave up trying to find out. Any knowledge I might gain was useless. I had no means of controlling where I was going, no rudder, no sails, no motors, some oars, but insufficient brawn. What was the point of plotting a course if I could not act on it? And even if I could, how should I know where to go? West, back to where we came from. East, to America. North, to Asia. South, to where the shipping lanes were. Each seemed the good and bad course in equal measure. So I drifted. Winds and currents decided where I went. Time became distance from me, the way it was for all mortals. I traveled down the road of life, and I did other things with my fingers than try to measure latitude. I found out later that I traveled a narrow road, the Pacific equatorial countercurrent. Chapter 66. I fished with a variety of hooks. At a variety of depths for a variety of fish, from deep sea fishing with large hooks and many stinkers to surface fishing in smaller hooks and one or two stinkers. Success was slow to come. And when it did, it was much appreciated, but the effort seemed out of proportion to the reward. The hours were long, the fish were small, and Richard Parker was forever hungry. It was the gaffs that finally proved to be my most valuable fishing equipment. They came in 3 screw-in pieces, 2 tubular sections that formed the shaft, one with a mounted plastic handle at its end and a ring for securing the gaff with a rope, and a head that consisted of hook measuring about 2 inches across its curve and ending in a deep, sharp, barbed point. Assembled, each gaff was about 5 feet long and felt as light as sturdy as a sword. At first I fished in open water. I would sink the gaff to a depth of 4 feet or so, sometimes with a fish speared on the hook as bait, and I would wait for hours, my body tense till it ached. When a fish was in just the right spot, I jerked the gaff up with all the might and speed I could muster. It was a split-second decision. Experience taught me it was better to strike when I felt I had a good chance of success than to strike wildly for a fish. Learns from experience too. I rarely falls for the same trap twice. When I was lucky, a fish would probably snagged on the hook. It paled, and I would confidently bring it aboard. But if I gaffed a large fish in the stomach or tail, it would often get away with a twist and a forward spurt of speed. Injured, it would be easy prey for another predator. A gift I'm not meant to make, so with a large fish, I aimed for the ventral area, beneath their gills and their lateral fins. For a fish instinctive reaction when struck there was to swim up away from the hook in the very direction I was pulling. Thus it would happen sometimes more pricked than actually gaffed. A fish would burst out of the water in my face. I quickly lost my revulsion of touching sea life. Nothing of this Percy fish blanket business anymore. A fish jumping out of water was confronted by a famished boy, with a hands-on, no-holds-barred approach to capturing it. If I felt the gaff's hold was uncertain, I would let go of it. I had not forgotten to secure it with a rope to the raft, and I would catch at the fish with my hands, fingers, though blunt, were more nimble than a hook. The struggle would be fast and furious. Those fish were slippery and desperate, and I was just plain desperate. If I only had as many arms as the goddess Durga, two to hold the gaffs, four to grasp the fish, and two to wield the hatchets. But I had to make do with two. I stuck fingers into eyes, jammed hands into gills, crushed soft stomachs with knees, bit tails with my teeth. I did whatever was necessary to hold a fish down until I could reach for the hatchet and chop its head off. With time and experience, I became a better hunter. I grew bolder and more agile. I developed an instinct, a feel for what to do. My success improved greatly when I started using part of the cargo net. As a fishing net, it was useless too. It was useless. Too stiff and heavy, and with a weave that wasn't tight enough, but it was perfect as a lure. Trailing freely in the water, it proved irresistibly attracted to fish, and even more so when seaweed started growing on it. Fish that were local in the ambit made the net their neighborhood, and the quick ones, the ones that tended to streak by, the Dorados slowed down to visit the new development. Neither the residents nor the travelers ever suspected that our hook was hidden at the weave. There were some days too few, unfortunately, when I could have all the fish I cared to gaff. At such times, I hunted far beyond the needs for any needs of my hunger or my capacity to cure. There simply wasn't enough space on the lifeboat or lines on the raft to dry so many strips of Dorado fish. Dorado flying fish, jacks, groupers, and mackerels, let alone space in my stomach to eat them. I kept what I could and gave the rest to Richard Parker. During those days of plenty, I laid my hands on so many fish that my body began to glitter from all the fish scales that became stuck to it. I wore these spots of shine and silver like tilaks, the marks of color that we Hindus wear on our foreheads, a symbol of the divine. If sailors had come upon me, I'm sure they would have thought that I was a fish god standing atop his kingdom, and they would have stopped. Those were the good days. They were rare. Turtles were an easy catch indeed, as the survival manual said. They were under the hunting and gathering heading. They would also go under gathering, solid in build. Though they were like tanks, they were neither fast nor powerful swimmers. With just one hand gripped around a back flipper, it was impossible to hold on to a turtle, but the survival manual failed to mention that a turtle caught was not a turtle had. It still needed to be brought aboard, and hauling a struggling 130-pound turtle aboard a lifeboat was anything but easy. It was a labor that demanded feats of strength worthy of Hanuman. I did it by bringing the victim alongside the bow of the boat, carapace against hull and tying a rope to its neck, and a front flipper and back flipper. Then I pulled until I thought my arms would come apart and my head would explode. I ran the ropes around the tarpaulin hooks and opposite side of the bow. Every time a rope yielded a little, I secured my game before the rope slid back. Inch by inch, a turtle was heaved out of the water. It took time. I remember one green sea turtle that hung from the side of the lifeboat up for 2 days, and the whole while thrashing about madly. Free slippers helped me with madly. Free slippers beating in the air. Luckily, at the last stage on the lip of the gunnel, it would often happen that a turtle would help me without meaning to. In an attempt to free its painfully twisted flippers, it would pull on them. If I pulled on the same moment, our conflicting efforts sometimes came together and suddenly it would happen, easily in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. A turtle would surge over the gunnel and slide onto the tarpaulin. I would fall back exhausted but jubilant. Green sea turtles gave more meat than hawksbills, and their belly shells were thinner, but they tended to be bigger than hawksbills, often too big to lift out of the water for the weakened castaway that I became. Lord, to think that I'm a strict vegetarian, to think that when I was a child I always shuddered when I snapped open a banana because it sounded to me like a breaking an animal's neck. I descended to a level of savagery I never imagined possible. Chapter 67. The underside of the raft became host to a multitude of sea life, like the net, but similar in form. I started with a soft green algae that clung to the life jackets. Stiffer algae of a darker kind joined it. They did well and became thick. Animal life appeared. The first that I saw were tiny, translucent shrimp, hardly half an inch long. They were followed by fish no bigger that looked like they were permanently under X-ray. Their internal organs showed through their transparent skins. After that, I noticed the black worms with the white spines, the green gelatinous slugs with the primitive limbs, the inch-long moldly colored fish with the pod bellies, and lastly the crabs, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch across and brown color. I tried everything but the worms, including the algae. Only the crabs didn't have an unpalatably bitter or salty taste. Every time they appeared, I popped them one after another into my mouth like candy, and there was none left. I couldn't control it. It was a long wait between fresh crops of crabs. The whole of the lifeboat invited life too. In the form of gooseneck barnacles, I sucked their fluid. Their flesh made for good fishing bait. I became attached to these oceanic hitchhikers, though they weighed the raft down a little. They provided distraction like Richard Parker. I spent many hours doing nothing but lying on my side, a life jacket pushed out of place a few inches like a curtain from a window so that I might have a clear view. What I saw was an upside-down town, small, quiet, and peaceable, whose citizens went about with the sweet civility of angels. The sight was a welcome relief for my frayed nerves. Chapter 68. My sleep pattern changed. Though I rested all the time, I rarely slept longer than an hour or so at a stretch. Even at night, it was not the ceaseless motion of the sea that disturbed me, nor the wind. You get used to those when the way you get used to lumps in a mattress. It was apprehension and anxiety that roused me. It was remarkable how little sleep I got on by. Unlike Richard Parker, he became a champion napper. Most of the time he rested beneath the tarpaulin, but on calm days when the sun was too harsh and on the calm nights when he came out, one of his favorite positions in the open was lying on his stern bench on the side, stomach overhanging the edge from it, front and back legs extending built down the side benches. It was a lot of tiger to squeeze onto a fairly narrow ledge, but he managed it by making his back very round. When he was truly sleeping, he laid his head on his front legs, but when his mood was slightly more active, when he might choose to open his eyes to look around, he turned his head and lay his chin on the ground. Another favorite position of his was sitting with his back to me, his rear half resting on the floor of the boat and his front half on the bench, his face buried into the stern paws right next to his head, looking as if we were playing hide and seek and he were the one counting. It was this position he tended to lie very still, with only the occasional twitching of his ears to indicate that he was not necessarily sleeping. Chapter 69. On many nights I was convinced I saw a light in the distance. Each time I set off a flare, when I had used up the rocket flares, I expended the hand flares. Were they ships that failed to see me, the light of rising or setting stars bouncing off the ocean? Breaking waves that moonlight had forlorn hope fashioned into illusion? Whatever the case, every time it was for nothing, even never result. Always the bitter emotion of hope raised and dashed. In time I gave up entirely on being saved by a ship. If the horizon was 2.5 miles away at an altitude of 5 feet, how far away was it when I was sitting against the mast of my raft, my eyes not even 3 feet above water? What chance was there that a ship crossing the whole great big Pacific would cut into a tiny circle? Not only that, it would cut into such a tiny circle and see me. What chance was there of that? No humanity, and its unreliable ways could not be counted upon. It was land that I had to reach, hard, firm, certain land. I remember the smell of the spent hand flare shells. By some freak of chemistry, they smelled exactly like cumin. It was intoxicating. I sniffed the plastic shells, and immediately Pondicherry came to life in my mind. A marvelous relief from the disappointment of calling for help and not being heard. The experience was very strong, nearly a hallucination. From a single smell, a whole town arose. Now when I smell cumin, I see the Pacific Ocean. Richard Parker always froze when a hand flare hissed to life. Had his eyes, round pupils the size of pinpricks, fixed on the light steadily. It was too bright for me, a blinding white center from a pinkish red, aureole. I had to turn away. I had the flare in the air at arm's length and waved it slowly. For a minute, heat showered down upon my forearm, and everything was weirdly lit. Water around the raft until a moment before opaquely black showed itself to be crowded with fish. Okay, there's chapter 70, 71, 72, 73, 74. How many chapters are there? 100. There's 100 chapters. All right. To scroll up again. Water went around the raft until a moment before a piggly black showed itself to be crowded with fish. Chapter 70. Butchering a turtle was hard work. My first one was a small hawksbill. It was its blood that tempted me, the good, nutritious, salt-free drink promised by the survival manual. My thirst was that bad. I took hold of the turtle shell and grappled with one of its black flippers. When I had a good grip, I turned over in the water and attempted to pull it onto the raft. The thing was thrashing violently. I would never be able to deal with it on the raft. Either I let it go or I tried my luck on the lifeboat. I looked up. It was a hot and cloudless day. Richard Parker seemed to tolerate my presence at the bow on such days. When the air was like the inside of an oven, he did not move from under the tarpaulin until sunset. I held on to one of the turtle's back flippers with one hand and pulled up on the rope to the lifeboat with the other. It was not easy climbing aboard. When I managed it, I jerked the turtle in the air and brought it onto its back on the tarpaulin. That I had hoped Richard Parker did no more than growl once or twice. He was not up to exerting himself in such heat. My determination was grim and blind. I felt I had no time to waste. I turned to the survival manual as to a cookbook. It said to lay the turtle on its back. Done. It advised me that a knife should be inserted into its neck to serve the arteries and veins through it. I looked at the turtle. There was no neck. The turtle had retracted into its shell. All that showed of its head was its eyes and beak, surrounded by circles of skin. It was looking at me upside down with a stern expression. I took hold of the knife and helped to goad it. Poked the front flipper. It shrank further into its shell. It only shrank further into its shell. I decided on a more direct approach. As confidently as I had done it 1,000 times, I jammed the knife just to the right of the turtle's head. At an angle, I pushed the blade deep into the folds of skin and twisted it. The turtle retreated even further, devoured the side where the blade was, and suddenly shot its head forward, beak snapping at me viciously. I jumped back. All four flippers came out, and the creatures tried to make its getaway. I rocked its head. It rocked on its back, flippers beating wildly and head shaking from side to side. I took hold of a hatchet and brought it down on the turtle's neck, gashing it. Bright red blood shot out. I grabbed the beaker and collected about 300 milliliters of pop cans worth. I might have gone much more later, I would guess, but the turtle's beak was sharp and its front flippers were long and powerful with 2 claws on each. The blood managed to gave off no particular smell. I took a sip. I tasted warm and an animal. If my memory was right, it was hard to remember first impressions, so I drank the blood to the last drop. I thought I would use the hatchet to remove the tough belly shell, but it proved easier than with the saw-tooth edge of the knife. I set one foot at the center of the shell and the other clear of the failing flippers. The leathery skin at the head end of the shell was easy cutting except around the flipper sawing away at the rim. However, where shell met shell, it was hard work, especially as the turtle wouldn't stop moving. By the time I had gone all the way around, I was bathed in sweat and exhausted. I pulled on the belly shell. It lifted reluctantly. With a wet sucking sound, inner life was revealed, twitching and jerking muscles, fat, blood, guts, and bones. And still the turtle thrashed about. I slashed its neck to the vertebrae. It made no difference. Flippers continued to beat. With 2 blows of the hatchet, I cut its head right off. The flippers did not stop. Worse, the separating head, and on gulping for air and blinking its eyes, I pushed into the sea. The living rest of the turtle I lifted and dropped into Richard Parker's territory. He was making noises and sounded as if he were about to stir. He probably smelled the turtle's blood. I fled to the raft. I watched sullenly as he loudly appreciated my gift and made a joyous mess of himself. I was utterly spent. The effort of butchering the turtle had hardly seemed worth a cup of blood. I started thinking seriously about how I was going to deal with Richard Parker. The forbearance on his part on hot, cloudless days, if that is what it was, and not simple laziness, was not good enough. I couldn't always be running away from him. I needed safe access to the locker and the top of the tarpaulin, no matter the time of day or the weather. No matter his mood, it was nights I needed, the sorts of nights that come with might. It was time to impose myself and carve out my territory. Chapter 71. To those who should ever find themselves in a predicament such as I was in, I would recommend the following program. Choose a day when the waves are small but regular. You want a sea that will put on a good show when your lifeboat is broadside to it, though without capsizing your boat. 2. Stream your sea anchor full out to make your lifeboat as stable as comfortable as possible. Prepare your safe haven from the lifeboat in case you should need it. You most likely will if you can't devise some means of bodily protection. Almost anything can make a shield. Wrapping clothes or blankets around your limbs will make a minimal form of armor. 3. Now comes the difficult part. You must provoke the animal that is afflicting you. Tiger, rhinoceros, ostrich, wild boar, brown bear, no matter the beast, you must get its goat. The best way to do this will most likely be to go to the edge of your territory and noisily intrude into the neutral zone. I did just that. I went to the edge of the tarpaulin and stamped upon the I just lost my place. I did just that. I went to the edge of the tarpaulin and stamped upon the middle bench as I mildly blew into the whistle. It is important that you make a constant, recognizable noise to signal your aggression. But you must be careful. You want to provoke your animal, but not only so much. You don't want it to attack you outright. If it does, God be with you. You will be torn to pieces, trampled flat, disemboweled, very likely eaten. You don't want that. You want an animal that is peeved, vexed, bothered, irked, annoyed, but not homicidal. Under no circumstances should you step into your animal's territory. Contain your aggression to staring into its eyes and hurling toots and taunts. When your animal has been roused, work in all bad faith to provoke a border intrusion. A good way of bringing this about, in my experience, is to back off slowly as you were making your noises. Be sure not to break eye contact. As soon as the animal that laid a paw on your territory, even made a determined advance into your neutral territory, you had achieved your goal. Don't be picky or legalistic as to where its paw actually handed. Be quick to be affronted. Don't wait to misconstrue as fast as you can. The point here is to make your animal understand that its neighbor is exceptionally persnickety about territory. That was 4. Okay, that was 3, 4, 5. Number 5. Once your animal has trespassed upon your territory, begin flagging in your outrage. Whether you have fled to your safe haven of the lifeboat or retreated to the back of your territory on the lifeboat, start blowing your whistle at full blast and immediately trip the sea anchor. These two actions are of pivotal importance. You must not delay putting them into effect. If you can help your lifeboat get broadside to the waves by other means, with an oar, for example, apply yourself right away. The faster your lifeboat branches the waves, the better. 6. Blowing a whistle continuously is exhausting for the weakened castaway. But you must not falter. Your alarmed animal must associate its increasing nausea with the shrill cries of the whistle. You can help things move along by standing at the end of your boat, feet off on opposing gunwales, and swaying in rhythm to the motion imparted by the sea. However slight you are, however large your lifeboat, you will be amazed at the difference this will make. I assure you, no time you'll have your lifeboat rocking and rolling like Elvis Presley. Don't forget to be blowing your whistle all the while, and mind you, don't make your lifeboat capsize. 7. Okay, that was 6. This is 7. You want to keep going until the animal, that is your burden, your tiger, your rhinoceros, whatever, is probably green about the gills with seasickness. You want to hear it heaving and dry retching. You want to see it lying at the bottom of the lifeboat, limbs trembling, eyes rolled back, a deathly rattle coming from its grasping mouth. And all the while, you must be shattering the animal's ears with piercing blows to your whistle. If you become sick yourself, don't waste your vomiting by sending overboard. Vomiting makes an excellent border guard. Puke on the edges of your territory. When your animal appears good and sick, you can stop. Seasickness comes on quickly, but it takes a long while to go away. You don't want to overstate your case. No one dies of nausea, but it can seriously sap the will to live. When enough is enough, stream the sea anchor, try to give shade to your animal as if it has collapsed in direct sunlight, and make sure it has water available when it recovers. With anti-seasickness tablets dissolved in it, if you don't have any. Dehydration is a serious danger at this point. Otherwise, retreat to your territory and leave your animal in peace. Water, rest, and relaxation, besides a stable lifeboat, will bring back to life. The animal should be allowed to recover fully before going to steps 1 to 8 again. Number 9. Treatment should be repeated until association in animals' minds between the sound of the whistle and the feeling of intense incapacitating nausea is fixed and totally unambiguous. Thereafter, the whistle alone will deal with trespassing or any other untoward behavior. Just one shrill blow, and you'll see your animal shudder with malice and repair at top speed to the safest further part of its territory. Once this level of training is reached, use of the whistle will be spared. Chapter 72. In my case, to protect myself from Richard Parker, while I trained him, I made a shield with a turtle shell. I cut a notch on each side of the shell and connected them with the length of a rope. The shield was heavier than I would have liked, but do soldiers ever get to choose their ordnance? At the time I tried, Richard Parker bared his teeth, rotated his ears full round, vomited a short, gradual roar, and charged. A great full-clawed paw rose in the air and cuffed my shield. The blow sent me flying off the boat. I hit the water instantly, let go of the shield. I sank without a trace after hitting me in the shin. I was beside myself with terror of Richard Parker, but also being in the water. In my mind, a shark was at that very second shooting up from me. I swam for the raft at frantic strokes, precisely the sort of wild thrashing that sharks find so deliciously inviting. Luckily, there were no sharks. I left the raft, let out all the rope, and sat with my arms wrapped around my knees and my head down. trying to pull out the fire of fear that was blazing within me. It was a long time before the trembling of my body stopped completely. I stayed on the raft for the rest of that day, and the whole night I did not eat or drink. I was at it again next time I caught a turtle. Its shell was smaller, lighter, and made for a better shield. Once more I was advanced and started stamping on the middle bench with my foot. I wonder if those who hear this story will understand that my behavior was not an act of insanity or a covert suicide attempt, but a simple necessity. Either I tamed him and made him who was number one or who was number two, or I died that day. I wanted to climb aboard the lifeboat during rough weather and be ejected. If I survived my apprenticeship as a high seas animal trainer, it was because Richard Parker did not really want to attack me. Tigers, indeed all animals, do not favor violence as a means of settling scores. When animals fight, it was the intent to kill with the understanding that they may be killed. A clash of costly, and so animals have a full system of cautionary signals designed to avoid a showdown that they are quick to back down when they feel they can. Rarely will a tiger attack a fellow predator without warning. Typically, a head-on rush for the adversary will be made. With much snarling and growling just before it was too late, the tiger will freeze. The menace rumbling deep in its throat will appraise the situation. If it decides that there is no threat, it will turn away, feeling that its point has been made. Richard Parker had made his point with me 4 times. 4 times he struck at me with his right paw and sent me overboard, and 4 times I lost my shield. I was terrified before, during, and after each attack, and I spent a long time shivering with fear on the raft. Eventually, I learned to read the signals he was sending before me. I found that with his ears, his eyes, his whiskers, his teeth, and his tail and his throat, he spoke a simple, forcefully punctuated language that told me what his next move might be. I learned to back down before he lifted his paw in the air. Then I made my point, feet on the gunwale, boat rolling, my singular note language blasting from the whistle, and Richard Parker moaning and gasping at the bottom of the boat. My 5th shield lasts me the rest of his training. Okay, chapter 73. I'll read to chapter 75. My greatest wish other than salvation was to have a book. A long book with a never-ending story. One I could read again and again, with new eyes and a fresh understanding each time. Unless there is no scripture in the lifeboat, it was a disconsolate Arjuna in a battered chariot without the benefit of Krishna's words. The first time I came upon a Bible in the bedside table of a hotel room in Canada, I burst into tears. I set a contribution to the Gideons the very next day, with a note urging them to spread the range of their activity to all places where worn and very weary travelers might lay down their hands, not just to hotel rooms, and they should leave not only Bibles but other sacred writings as well. I cannot think of a better way to spread the faith. No thundering from a pulpit, no condemnation from bad churches, no peer pressure, just a book of scripture quietly waiting to say hello, as gentle, as powerful as a little girl's kiss on your cheek. At the very least, if I had a good novel, but there was only the survival manual, which I must have read 10,000 times over the course of my ordeal. I kept a diary. It was hard to read. I wrote as small as I could. I was afraid I would run out of paper. There's not much to do. Words scratched on a page, trying to capture a reality of reality that overwhelmed me. I started it a week or so after thinking of the Simpsons. Before that, I was too busy and scattered. The entries are not dated or numbered. What strikes me now is how time how time is captured. Several days, several weeks, all on one page. I talked about what you might expect, about things that happened and how I felt, about what I caught and what I didn't, about seas and weather, about problems and solutions, about Richard Parker, all practical stuff. Chapter 74. I practiced religious rituals that I adapted to the circumstances, solitary masses without priests or consecrated communion hosts, darshans without murtis, and pujas with turtle meat for prasad. Acts of devotion to Allah, not knowing where Mecca was and getting my Arabic wrong. They brought me comfort, that is certain, but it was hard. Oh, it was hard. Faith in God is an opening up, a letting go, a deep trust, a free act of love, but sometimes it was so hard to love. Sometimes my heart was sinking so fast with anger. Desolation and weariness. I was afraid it would sink at the very bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and I would not be able to lift it back up. At such moments, I tried to elevate myself. I would touch the turban I had made with the remnants of my shirt, and I would say aloud, "This is God's hat." I would pat my pants and say aloud, "This is God's attire." I would point to Richard Parker and say aloud, "This is God's cat." I would point to the lifeboat and say, "This is God's ark." I would point to the lifeboat and say aloud, "This is God's ark." I would speak my hands wide and say aloud, "These are God's acres." I would point at the sky and say aloud, "This is God's ear." And in this way, I would remind myself creation and of the place in it. But God's hat was always unraveling. God's pants were falling apart. God's cat was a constant danger. God's ark was a jail. God's wide acres were slowly killing me. God's ear didn't seem to be listening. Despair was a heavy blackness that let no light in or out. It was a hell beyond expression. Thank God it always passed. A school of fish appeared around the net, or a knot cried out to be reckoned. Or I thought of my family, how they were spared this terrible agony. The blackness would stir and eventually go away, and God would remain a shining point of light in my heart. I would go on loving. Chapter 75. On the day when I estimated it was my brother's birthday, I sang happy birthday to her out loud. Okay, guys, I think I'm done reading for today. Oh, I have some chat. Speedrun tactics, give every third word. Ooh. Darn, thank you, GH. Darnell Lambeth, I hope everyone is having a relaxing evening. Thank you. I hope you're having a relaxing evening too. Yes, so I have 25 chapters left. I'm gonna read on Wednesday too. I might change that tomorrow, I'm not sure. But yeah, so I'm planning on reading the rest. I have like 70 pages left, so maybe I can split it up between tomorrow and Wednesday, but I will see. Anyways, thank you for coming, Mark Heredia, Darnell Lambeth, and GH. I hope you guys have a wonderful night. Thank you, and